you all for joining us today for the third and final webinar of RegNet's 2021 Conversation Series. Our theme for this year is Connection and Disconnection. I'm excited to welcome you all to today's panel on global connections and disconnections, markets, state, and earth. Before we begin, I would like to first acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which we are meeting today, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. I am on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, but know that many of you are joining us from other lands near and far. As a school that cares deeply about questions of justice and equity, we at RegNet stand in solidarity with the First Nations activists and communities who have been working to bring attention to struggles still faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. RegNet is a hub where we collaborate between disciplines to understand how governance and regulation are shaped by connections and disconnections. COVID-19 has redefined the meaning of connection and disconnection. The global pandemic has disconnected us in ways we could not imagine, but despite that, we keep finding new ways to connect. Conversations 2021 has hosted a series of panels aiming to illuminate how connections and disconnections shape the outcomes across domains including justice, welfare, and trade. Conversations is a series that emerged to capture discussions happening in the RegNet building and to spark new discussions across RegNet and beyond. However, not all voices in RegNet are represented here. We are over 20 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, and not everyone has experienced the disruption of this pandemic in the same way. The uneven distribution of the load of the pandemic is one of many factors shaping the voices that are captured in this discussion, and is one of the many areas where we need to continue to have conversations now and in the future. Today, we will be part of an exciting conversation about global connections from a panel of RegNet scholars. On the panel are Associate Professor Christian Downey, Emeritus Professor Peter Drahos, Professor Anthea Roberts, Dr. Jensen Sass, Alex San Martin Portez, and Dr. Dirk van der Klee. They will be speaking about impacts of global strategic competition on relationships between actors and institutions, and the potential for growing strategic competition to recast how we govern the globe. The panel is facilitated by Associate Professor Christian Downey. His work focuses on the politics and governance of energy and climate change, and the lessons for national and foreign policy. Emeritus Professor Peter Drahos is a RegNet professor and also Professor of Law and Governance at the European University Institute, Florence, and holds a chair in Intellectual Property, Queen Mary, University of London. His current research interests span intellectual property law, regulatory and governance theory, trade negotiations, and international business regulation. Professor Anthea Roberts specializes in public international law, international economic law, comparative international economic law, and the effect of geopolitical change on global governance. Her current research interests include the development of frameworks and tools for understanding and navigating complex and emerging phenomena. Dr. Jensen Sass spans two substantive fields within his research, covering political science and sociology, the comparative study of political deliberation, and corporate power and democratic politics. Alex San Martin Portez is a PhD scholar at RegNet and holds a master's degree in public economics, law, and politics from Leuphana University in Germany. His current research focuses on implementation of patent protection in Latin American countries and investigating these intellectual property rights and how they affect the formulation of sustainable development policies. And Dr. Dirk van der Klee is a research fellow at RegNet who specializes on the theory of geoeconomics, international economic sanctions, PRC international economic policy, and the effect of industrial policy on geopolitics. Before I hand over to Christian, just a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded, and your name and voice will be recorded and audible to others listening to the webinar if you choose to ask a question verbally. The video and audio of our speakers, including their shared screens, will be recorded. Throughout the presentation, your video will be turned off and you will be muted, so we will only be able to hear the speakers and conveners. However, if you would like to ask a question, you can do so by submitting your questions in written form via the chat function, actually via the Q&A function, or you can use the raise your hand function at the end of the presentation. In that case, we'll take you off mute and you'll be able to ask your question verbally. And if you're on social media, you can tweet live by using the handle at ANU RegNet, which I think is also in the chat there. I'll now hand over to Christian, and I look forward to the conversation.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and let me join Lee in acknowledging the traditional owners on whose lands we meet and paying my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So, as Lee said, welcome to the final session of RegNet's conversation series this year, which is on connections and disconnections. Our focus is on connections and disconnections at the global level. Specifically, what we're all interested in is thinking about how strategic competition between states, what effect this is having on the relationships between actors and institutions across different policy domains. In March this year, China's top diplomat made headlines when he told officials at a US summit in Alaska, and I quote, that they did not have the qualification to speak to China from a position of strength. This quote made headlines because of who was saying it, one of China's most senior diplomats, and also because of when it was said. It was the first meeting with senior officials meeting with the incoming Biden administration. But it was also just one more sign of the growing strategic competition, it would seem, between the US and China. Indeed, the rise of the US alongside a host of emerging economies, including India and Brazil, is part of what's typically conceived as a shifting balance of power in the international system. So for the last 2 centuries, more or less, the rules of the world have been written by Americans and Europeans. But today, this is changing as emerging powers call into a question some of the existing rules that govern the globe. So in this session, we take as our starting point the new connections and disconnections that are developing between states and the effects this could have on how we govern the globe. Some states will remain connected, sharing technology, finance, and data. Others may not. So, for example, Australia has already started screening out foreign investment from China for energy infrastructure, including in our electricity grid. Firms may also find new state controls imposed on them, and they might find their restrictions curtailed or enabled in other domains. We see this already in the telecommunication space, in part because of the data that telecommunication companies hold, and it's likely that firms, technology firms in particular, but a whole host of firms may have their operations impeded in different parts of the globe. So what we're really interested in exploring in this session is these kind of entanglements and their effects across actors and institutions in domains including climate, energy, trade, and intellectual property. Each of us comes from quite different disciplinary perspectives and quite different domain expertise. But what we all have an interest in is thinking about this relationship between strategic competition and the regulations and governance in these domains, a topic that I'd argue is frequently overlooked, and when it is considered, often not across such a multiplicity of domains. So it's a privilege today to have such an excellent group of scholars to reflect on these issues. I won't introduce anyone, as Lee already has, but I'll hand it over in a moment to Peter. The session's going to run, as you likely know, till 2 p.m. Each speaker will have around 5 to 10 minutes. Then we'll have a bit of a discussion as a group before I open it up to the Q&A. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and Peter, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. So thanks very much. Thanks very much, Christian, and thank you to Lee for the introduction. So with 5 minutes or thereabouts, let me jump right in. The analytical frame I'd just like to put on the table here is the idea that a disconnection can have a countervailing connection, and similarly a connection can have a countervailing disconnection. And the other analytical link here is the idea that disconnections or connections can be mutually reinforcing. Now, it may be that the logic of connection and disconnection runs a bit deeper than just those two properties of being countervailing and being mutually reinforcing, but for 5 minutes, that's all the analytical frame that we need. So let me shift to what I think we can all agree is the first really big disconnection that we're all facing, and that is between states and markets on the one side and the earth on the other. Now, we've had evidence of this disconnection for a very long time. You know, we've known for decades that our consumption of resources runs well ahead of our capacity to live on the earth sustainably. That's a problem that we've talked about a lot, but talk is cheap. We haven't really done much about it except to put up some framework agreements, maybe save a few rivers here and there, but overall, the scientific evidence suggests we've got a problem. What is the countervailing connection here? Well, I think one that I'd like to draw attention to, and that we probably haven't paid enough attention to, is that these crises, as they get more and more extreme, so we think of extreme weather events, for example, the pandemic is yet another example of a global extreme event, are generating, I think, much more interest from people in local government. You know, what is it that local government can do for me now when I'm confronted by this extreme weather event, whether it's a fire or a flood or some other catastrophe? And I think we've seen this in Australia with obviously the premiers playing a much stronger leadership role than I can certainly remember in my time of observing federation. But it's not just premiers, I think it's local government generally. And I think as the disconnection between state, market and earth gets bigger and bigger, there will be a renewed activism and interest in local governments and particularly trying to figure out what local governments can do to address these things and help people ultimately survive the crises. So that's the first, I think, countervailing connection that's been driven by a really big disconnection. The second really big disconnection that I'd like to draw attention to is one that Christian already has, which is the disconnection between US and China. And, you know, we have lots and lots of evidence of this. I mean, Trump's trade war is an obvious example, the way in which the United States is placing Chinese companies on various export control lists, the way in which it's slowing down the acquisition of technology by China. There are many examples of this. And in a book I published earlier this year, I argue that this disconnection is actually deeply reinforcing of the disconnection I've just managed, which is between the earth, state and markets. But what is the countervailing connection here that I'd like to draw attention to? Well, I think the really important one for me, and one that I know very little about, and I think some of the other speakers will talk about this, the countervailing connection here is the one between Russia and China. Now, you know, I'm not an expert on Russia and China relationships, but the little I do know is that the old Soviet Union played a profound role in the industrialization of China. It in effect, the old Soviet Union transferred an awful lot of technology in the steel and iron making and chemical industries to China when it was unable to obtain those technologies from anywhere else in the world. So the Soviet Union had a profound rise. And I think the effect of the disconnection between the United States and China will be to renew in ways that we don't yet fully understand the connection between Russia and China. And we've already got evidence of this. I mean, the way in which, for example, Russia is prepared to transfer technology to China in the area of vaccine technology. And I think if we look at the history of the old Soviet Union, when they transfer technology, they really transfer technology. I mean, in the sense that they make things work. And it wasn't just to China that the old Soviet Union transferred technology. It also transferred antibiotics technology to India, for example, and engendered a global Indian pharmaceutical industry. So the capacity of Russia to make these things work is something, you know, we need to pay attention to. So let me conclude by saying something about the mutually reinforcing disconnection that I now see. So I've talked about countervailing connections, but I think there is a really important mutually reinforcing disconnection here of the disconnection between the United States and China and nature. I mean, pretty clearly, we are in the late stages of a climate crisis, and that does, as you know, any economist would say, require massive levels of cooperation on a global public good. Now, what a global public good is, essentially, is the sharing of knowledge. It doesn't necessarily mean the sharing of technology. And there's a very important conceptual difference between technology sharing and the sharing of knowledge. And in all sorts of ways, the United States is making that sharing of knowledge extraordinarily difficult. And, you know, one can drill into the micro detail of this, and I don't have time to do that. But if you have a look at, say, the Department of Justice initiative against American Chinese scientists over the last few years, in which they've been prosecuted, you know, under various allegations such as espionage and trade secret theft and so on. And then it's turned out that those things have been wildly exaggerated. But that has sent huge reverberations through the US academy, through US universities, and in all sorts of ways, we're really shattering at a micro level trust and cooperation that we really need for the world that we're heading into. And in my view, US leadership here is really deeply, deeply deficient. I mean, it's imposing an intellectual property model on the world, which is not about the sharing of knowledge. And, you know, poor people do not do well under monopoly models of technology diffusion. And I think, you know, if I were to go back to the history of technology diffusion, when I look at when the old Soviet Union did it and when China does it, you know, poor people's chances of being better off generally improve. When the United States does it, you know, it's far from clear that poor people's chances improve. So I do think we have a really fundamental and deep problem, which I talk about in the book that I published, Survival Governance, and I say that this is actually the biggest problem that we now face, and we face it under extreme temporal duress. We are not in the early stages of a climate crisis. We're in the late stages of a climate crisis. The big difference now is that the United States, in terms of strategic competition, was always in strategic competition with China. That's been true from day one. The only difference now is that China is in a much better position to respond. So, you know, before China was a member of the WTO, the United States could say to China, rewrite your patent law because we don't like it. The United States can no longer say that to China. Okay, so I really need to finish up there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. I want to pick up in a very similar vein to some of the things that Peter said. Obviously, we know that we're, as Peter said, in the late stages of a climate crisis. And if we're going to have any chance of avoiding the worst impacts of climate change, one thing we're going to have to do is decarbonise the energy sector, which is about 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, some of that's already happening, but in response to thinking about the transformations that are taking place in energy markets, scholars and policymakers have started to think about how changes in energy markets might reorder patterns of cooperation and conflict between states. In other words, how changes in energy markets might lead to geopolitical shifts. So an example might be that as a result of the shift to renewable energies, new renewable powers might emerge. Think of countries such as Chile with its vast solar resources. Other countries might face political instability, particularly those that rely on fossil fuels. So think of a country such as Nigeria, which derives large rents from oil, but has a fragile political system. Much closer to our doorstep, of course, is Timor-Leste, which could face similar instability. So there's been a little bit of work done on this topic at the moment, but I want to think a little bit like Peter said of how the causal arrow runs the other way. That is how changes in the relationships, the connections and disconnections between states could affect our capacity to swiftly decarbonise the energy sector and, of course, to try and meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So as I mentioned in the introduction, I think everyone is aware that there is this growing competition between the US and China and other states. But the world is also on the course for catastrophe, not because of this competition, but because of climate change. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the group of the world's leading scientists, has laid this bare in a series of reports over recent decades. And as Anatol Levin has made out in a recent book on making the realist case for action on climate change, he talks about how, barring a full-scale nuclear exchange between the great powers, there's really no security threat today in the world that comes anywhere near matching that posed by climate change. Existing both to the threat to existing states or to the damage being done by states already that's comparable to what climate change is already doing. And a little quick example he gives is pointing out that China's occupation of barely inhabitable islands in the South China Sea poses much less threat to killing Americans right now than thousands that die from heat stroke each year, which is caused and exacerbated by climate change. So we know we have to deal with climate change. I think we can make a pretty strong case that it's a security threat to states all around the world, and that we have to speed up the transformation of our energy sector. So what I wanted to do in a few minutes is just think a little bit about some of the mechanisms or pathways via which the strategic competition between the US and China and other states might actually impede our capacity to achieve that goal. And I should say this isn't part of a paper or an existing research. This is really kind of inspired a little bit by this conversation series. So very much welcome thoughts on other, on the types of pathways that we could think about in the discussion. I think the first and most obvious one is by which strategic composition could impede our goals is if competition develops into open conflict. I mean, very crudely speaking, if the two superpowers come into conflict, they will literally obliterate any chance we have to address climate change. That's probably the most scary proposition and perhaps the most obvious one. A second one, which Peter touched on, is technologies. If clean energy technologies are to be developed, are to be scaled and deployed at the speed that we need, we're likely going to need to have both US innovation capacity and China's manufacturing capacity to deploy at speed and at scale. And China, as many of you will know, is already the largest manufacturer in the world of solar panels, of electric vehicles, of batteries, and it's reached this position in less than 2 decades, which is quite rapid by historical comparisons. So growing competition around technology obviously is another pathway that could undermine us. And a third area that I wanted to touch on is finance, because I think there's a risk that the competition between these two players could really derail attempts to mobilize the trillions needed in finance, both to support clean energy technologies, but also the need to cut off the billions of dollars that are still pouring in to fossil fuel projects. And a good illustration of this is public finance for coal. And this is also an illustration of how strategic competition is affecting the rules that govern the globe. So we know that G20 countries, basically the 20 largest countries in the world, have spent billions in public money building new coal-fired power plants overseas. We see that in our region. There's been a wave of new coal projects in Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, and Vietnam, largely supported by money coming from China, Japan, South Korea, and a number of other countries. And in 2015, the OECD got together and put together an agreement to try and limit this funding. And it's likely that we'll see these rules strengthen. There's a whole range of loopholes in them, but it's likely we'll see them strengthen over the next 12 months. The problem, of course, is that China, now the largest international financier of international coal projects, is not a member of the OECD and is not part of that agreement. Now, in 2012, the US tried to bring China on board in what became known as the International Working Group, and there was negotiations to try and get China to sign up to the rules around international finance for energy projects, and specifically coal. But in almost a decade, those negotiations have gone nowhere. So I think once again, this competition between these two players, to the extent that it intensifies, will really damage any hope we have of establishing global rules to curtail public finance for international coal projects, and of course in time for oil and gas projects as well. So I'll leave it there. That's three perhaps of the most obvious pathways. I'm sure in the discussion we can think of many more. The only other point I think that is worth considering, of course, is whether strategic competition intensifying is actually inevitable, because many commentators point out that climate change and energy might be one area where the US and China could cooperate. But the key question is, can they actually cooperate in this policy domain while at the same time intensifying competition in other domains? And that's a question I think we'll come back to in the discussion. Thank you very much, everyone, and I'll hand it over now to Jensen.
Thanks, Christian, and thanks for organising the panel. Thanks also to Lee White for organising the series, and to the audience. The thought piece that I'd like to share today, I put together specifically for this panel, so it's a little bit experimental, and it has the immoderate title of Firms, States and Security, which could hardly be broader in scope. So the subject that I'd like to talk to you today, it concerns a pretty vast area of inquiry, which is what's sometimes called market-state relationships. Obviously, the study of these relationships is a topic of classical political economy, as well as classical social philosophy. And the topic and those bodies of thought have been reconstructed and extended in contemporary regulatory theory. Market-state relations are obviously a really crucial piece of the bigger puzzle that we're trying to put together here about the effect of the effect of geostrategic competition on global governance. So my in for this very large topic is an article that has a similar title to mine. It's Firms, States and Diplomacy, that was written by Susan Strange in 1992, nearly 30 years ago now. And the reason I'm drawing attention to the article is that it was an important article at the time, and it's a kind of classical or classic article now, which is perhaps a way of saying that it's more often cited than it is read. I think the article is worth reading and thinking about. So Strange had an important argument in that she suggested that the field of international relations had to urgently extend its purview. So international relations obviously is the study of politics between states. And Strange intervened and said, well, you know, there are actually more actors that we need to take into account in the then present era, and it's transnational corporations that really deserve pride of place. And she argued that transnational corporations mediate the relations between states, as well as mediating the way that states handle their internal politics, and they're constitutive actors, you know, within international relations. So you can't really just study international relations as politics or international business as separate fields. You really need to merge those fields to make sense of what's happening. So I'm drawing attention to Strange's argument for a few different reasons. The most important of which is that I want to challenge the argument. But there's nothing about the evidence that Strange amasses that I find problematic, nor about the inferences that she draws from that evidence, nor even from the concepts that she forms with those inferences. I think that's all pretty above board. And I don't think there's anything problematic normatively about the article or the argument if you see anything normative in it. So what is there left to challenge? I'd suggest that it's the scope of the argument that needs to be challenged. And the argument, as you'll appreciate, is kind of like an epical argument, okay? So the premise of what she's doing is to say, you know, the world has changed and therefore we need new theories in order to make sense of our world. And I think that Strange, you know, she did well. She did describe an epochal change, and she saw it clearly, and she saw it early. And on the scope question, I think that we may be entering a new epoch now, or at least that's the kind of conversational point that I wanted to raise, at least with respect to firm-state relations. And it's for that reason I think that her argument, if not challenging, it requires revisiting and perhaps extending in its own right. So very quickly, the epoch that Strange was trying to capture, we could label that of high globalization. So this is the period in the history of global capitalism when the logic of the market seemed to be sweeping over states. She was writing soon after the collapse of communism. There was a wave of authoritarian states democratizing. Global trade was suddenly ballooning. International communications technologies allowed firms to operate in a more transnational way. And states themselves sought to reconstitute themselves on the image of markets such that they would be more competitive and more efficient in the way they allocated resources. So Strange says, well, you know, based on all these structural changes and technological changes, states will be facing new dilemmas, and we need to characterize these. Among other things, states will be competing for capital. They're going to be competing for the good opinion of firms, and this is a new dimension of international affairs that we need to make sense of. So I'm not going to elaborate any further on her argument. I'll get to my punchline, which is to say that I think we're entering, or we may be entering, another epoch now, one that follows high globalization. Firms and states are facing new dilemmas in this epoch. And as such, they're going to be already compelled to develop new forms of policy and regulation in order to deal with these. The new dilemmas are not displacing the old dilemmas, rather they're going to be layered on top of them. So that's another way of saying that the international order is becoming more complex, and the challenges facing states are also more difficult to handle. So I'd propose that the epoch we're entering is defined by the increasing interpenetration of security concerns into the strategic behaviour of firms and their regulation by states. You'll be familiar with some very prominent cases of this kind in Australia and internationally: the Huawei decision, Trump's handling of TikTok, and the way that different countries, different states are negotiating the problem of Facebook is actually another example of this, to the degree that domestic politics and elections seem to be vulnerable to the firm's algorithms. So those are some prominent cases. I've identified about 50 more cases that pertain just to the last 2 years. So I think that this phenomenon is pretty widespread. At its limit, we might characterize our era or epoch as that of bifurcation. This is where global economic relations break down according to geostrategic alliances. But I'd suggest there are many possibilities spanning the distance between that rather Orwellian prospect and the globalist utopia of frictionless investment and trade. We're somewhere in between, and we don't yet know which direction or where we'll land. How new is any of this really? You know, one of the challenges with epoch-style arguments is that they don't actually set a measure against which they can be evaluated. That is to say, they don't stipulate just how different the world needs to be before you can pronounce that the world is different to what it was. To the degree there's not much new under the sun, the odds of us entering a new epoch are probably low. And there's plenty of good arguments to make in this case. If you think about the WikiLeaks revelations, by way of example, we discovered a fair bit about the role of US intelligence in monitoring the internal operations of foreign firms. This particularly in the energy sector, such that the US state is obviously paying a lot of political attention to what firms do. But taking a broader view, it's the case that states have always cordoned off particular industries, and they've always nominated particular corporations as national champions, and they've done this for geostrategic reasons. This is not new. In the early 20th century, Japan directed enormous resources to its shipbuilding industry. It did this to secure control over raw material sources that spread from Manchuria to Indonesia. The Japanese state was not prepared to leave these resources in the invisible hands of the market. Fascist regimes in Germany, Italy, and Spain avidly promoted domestic industrial conglomerates in the pursuit of a vision of autarky. We might think, well, this is just driven by ideology, but there are basic geostrategic reasons for these things as well. In fact, throughout the 19th century, continental European powers thought themselves vulnerable to each other. They saw their near neighbours as enemies. And for that reason, they invested very heavily in coal mining and steel production, and in many cases took outright control of those industries for two key reasons. First, you need coal to make steel, which is necessary for armaments. And secondly, you need rail to move those armaments around the country quickly, and also to move troops around the country quickly. So maybe these aren't new things at all. And yet, if we look at the international level, there's a sense that geopolitical relations have changed. As Peter said, China may always have been a strategic competitor to the United States. It's just a better competitor now than it was. Technology has also changed. And the point that I'd make here is that a greater proportion of the products we use have potential or real security implications. So this is why China places restrictions on where you can drive a Tesla vehicle in China. So the concern there is that these vehicles will be used by US intelligence to hoover up data. And it's the same reason that US authorities are now paying close attention to buses and rail stock that's made by Chinese companies, because these buses and trains have sophisticated sensing technologies that can collect real-time data and potentially beam it back to whoever wants it most. You might think that these dilemmas are really dilemmas just for the great powers. This is just a story about China and the United States. But just as post-Meiji Japan invested heavily in shipbuilding, the Japanese state of the early 21st century, forgive me, is investing heavily in shipbuilding and has recently provided enormous subsidies to TSMC, which is a major silicon chip manufacturer. Remarkably, Japan's efforts are completely dwarfed by those of South Korea, with the South Korean state recently announcing a commitment of $450 billion over the next decade to achieve chip sovereignty. And I'd encourage you to attempt to translate that concept into the discourse of high globalization and neoliberalism. I think there's something different going on here. Interestingly, Australia is now playing this game as well. You may have observed yesterday that Telstra's takeover of Digitel Pacific was approved by shareholders. This is just a very lovely turn of affairs. So in Telstra, we see a corporation whose privatisation could really be seen as one of the symbolic high points of neoliberal governance in Australia. And this private corporation is now being bankrolled by the state to the tune of $2 billion to take over a foreign firm that Telstra itself never had any commercial interests in. So as I noted earlier, I don't think that the dilemmas identified by Susan Strange are going away. I think states will continue competing for capital and for the good opinion of transnational firms. The point is that some even older dilemmas are attaining renewed prominence due to changing geostrategic relations and new forms of technology. So the first order of work, I think, is to understand the prevalence and defining characteristics of these security-driven market state entanglements. And beyond that, I think we need to examine how these security concerns enter and shape political and regulatory domains, and how they might be negotiated in the interests of such things as freedom, justice, inclusive growth, and earth governance. So in concluding, I can't say anything as certain or original about the current state of affairs as Susan Strange did 30 years ago, but I note in closing that neither the word security nor geopolitics appears even once in her argument about market-state relations, and for that reason, I think there's good reason to update her account. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jensen. And of course, thank you to Lee and also Christian for putting together this panel. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to jump basically on from where Jensen finished. I'm not going to be nearly as deep or epoch defining as Jensen was. I'm going to look at a sort of a high level idea that Anthea and I have been toying around with a little bit for about 9 months, but have yet found the time to write on it. It's concept of Galapaphonia or Galapafonication. And it goes to the question of bifurcation that Jensen raised, to the questions that Peter and Christian raised as well, that we're in a world where climate change is such a big threat that's right on our doorstep, but how do, the US and China sort of interact with each other. And this is sort of the framework that I think we're going to see, regardless of this being a big of climate change. I think regardless of climate change, we're going to end up going down something that looks like this route going forward. So Galapagophonia is basically two separate ideas that we've mashed together. One is the California effect, which a lot of you, I think everyone on this panel will probably be pretty familiar with, the idea that if you the leader in technology, you get certain benefits that, you know, your, not just your technology, but your regulations, the laws, the norms of usage, and of course IP gets diffused around the world, and you get to accrue quite a few benefits from that. And the US, as Peter said, has sort of strived to be an IP leader and an IP holder onto, and not particularly sharing it and trying to continue to accrue those benefits. And then you have the sort of opposite view, which is the Galapagophonia syndrome, which is traditionally applied to Japan, where you have a rising power that is intentionally trying to wall off some of its market to allow its own firms to develop their own capabilities before a foreign firm comes in and takes the entire market. And I think we can apply that to China pretty readily. The issue with this approach is, while you develop a domestic market, you know, and a domestic ecosystem, which we see now with China's internet ecosystem, just to take one, where you have firms that operate in a completely different environment to the rest of the world. When your firms want to go abroad in this kind of environment, they have to operate in a US or a California effect type of world. So we've seen Chinese firms go abroad since the late 90s. And when they've done that, they've basically been operating in a US-led order, and they've had to, you know, use the US financial system, accede to technology controls, you know, basically adhere to regulations that are sometimes US written, or at least US led, that might be diffused through international organizations as well. And that's fine. The problem is, once you get to a situation where we are now, all those advantages that the US has accrued can be used in a highly coercive manner if the US chooses to do so, and there's very little China can do about it, and that's no longer acceptable. That's the sort of very short, non-technical explanation of that. And so we're now in a world where China really can't accept that, and so it needs to develop some form of California effect for itself while still protecting its market in certain ways. And this is where we end up with Galapagophonia, where the Galapagophonia market, that's China, is trying to become more California, and then the US itself is also trying to wall off itself from China and just to stop information transfer to China. So it's having some Galapagos, I should practice these terms before I speak it in front of people. Galapagos, there's some Galapagos elements to its traditional California effect. And so what we're seeing is the two major powers are being more Galapagos towards each other, more California towards everyone else. They want to disperse their ideas, disperse their technology towards everyone else, while trying to, you know, have a bit of a walled garden with each other. Or at least, if you're going to attract, say, US investment into China, it's done so on terms that are acceptable to China, rather than saying IPOing on the US stock exchange. So that's the sort of theory there. So if I just, in order of, to try and keep time down, I mean, the examples are probably pretty obvious, but the first one, you know, that you think about this is, of course, the global financial system. China has run a controlled financial system. It's been hard to move money out. But that gives the US, that is the most powerful tool that the US has. If it wants to punish China or punish any country, it goes to that, and it can order basically any bank on planet Earth to not deal with a certain company if it wants to. Basically, China needs to get out from under that now, and it's trying in its own way to develop alternative systems. There's, of course, a capacity, there's a desire, and, you know, capacity, those two things don't always match up, but that's one example. Another example is, of course, internet sovereignty, where we're seeing two very different models here. And I'd point to this Digicel thing that we've just pointed, that Jensen just mentioned. I think this is actually an example of this, where, okay, Australia's on board with the US, and they're trying to ensure that there's a system where, you know, Australia and countries close to Australia, or in us being an ally of the US, are not necessarily operating in an environment where the major internet firm in our region, or in that region that's near us, is controlled by China. We can argue whether, you know, that was a realistic possibility, or, you know, just complete paranoia, but that's, I think, the thinking behind that. And I'll wrap up pretty quickly because I know we want people to have time to ask questions. There's a couple of other examples that I just draw to. So it's not all negative punishments. There's also positive versions. So Luban workshops is something that people probably don't know here, and they're a vocational college that China's trying to establish in other parts of the world. They've got 18 going now. They've probably got another 10, 15 on the horizon. And the idea is that you set up in a college, say in Thailand, and you'll train a lot of people on local technology for projects run by, on Chinese technology for projects being built in Thailand. And they'll be trained on, Chinese technology with Chinese standards. And the idea is here that they're going to connect vocational education to that. And of course, it's providing jobs for local people, all the things that, other emerging economies are asking for. But that's a very simple example of, every single action that's going to happen overseas now is going to be sort of thought of in these systems. How do we establish a system that works for us well, that of course is going to provide benefits for others, but does provide inherent disadvantages for our competitor. It's seen in competitor landscape. Whether that's fair or not, I think that's just how it's being seen by both. And this is going to provide opportunities and both challenges, I think, for all the countries in the region. We can discuss that once we get further on, but that's basically my time, and I'll hand over. Is it Alex next, and then Anthea, I think. All right, over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Doug. Hello, everyone. First, I want to just thank Christian and Lee and for having me today. So, given the global challenges we are facing, such as climate change, as debated by my colleagues, it has become clear how political competition and economic interests of states and firms affect the development of technologies that are essential for survival. So my brief intervention today continues to look into these issues from the perspective of the COVID-19 vaccine production. My goal here is to debate technology creation and technology sharing in a global economy dominated by private and national interests, and how this affects the provision of global public goods. And as we all know, the pandemic mobilized researchers and resources all over the world, resulting in one of the fastest vaccine development we have ever seen. But despite this huge mobilization, vaccine manufacturers have not achieved the scale of production necessary to vaccinate the entire world. And as a consequence, we observed inequality in international vaccine distribution. As recent data shows, high-income countries have vaccinated over 60% of their population, and some are already providing booster shots, while low-income countries are struggling to vaccinate even 5% of their population. And of course, vaccine production is a complex process, and there are different reasons for this gap, but I'll focus here on the international competition between Western countries and China concerning 3 different elements. So first, where technologies are developed. Second, where technologies are produced, and third, how technology has been distributed and vaccines have been distributed globally. So first, vaccine development often happens in an oligopolistic market of innovative firms concentrated in a few high-income countries and some emerging economies, including China. And these firms using different vaccine platforms and more innovative and promising technologies have been developed in Western countries, so in the US and Europe. And that's the case with the mRNA vaccines used by Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna. So vaccine development is highly concentrated, and new technologies are even more concentrated in high-income countries. Second, global vaccine production capacity is very limited, and firms have adopted different strategies to scale up their production. What we have seen is that Western firms, especially the most innovative ones, have not engaged in licensing and technology transfer agreements, but they have focused instead in expanding their own production capacity. And in contrast, we see Chinese firms promoting some technology transfer agreements in some middle-income countries, but these agreements are not very abundant. But despite of that, we have observed more engagement in general of Chinese firms with middle and low-income countries. And third, the development and production strategies at firm level also affect policies regarding vaccine diplomacy at state level. And we've seen here a difference as well between Western countries and China. So the US and some European countries, they have maintained a policy of vaccine donations. And these donations are done either directly by firms or organized internationally in initiatives such as the COVAX facility. On the other hand, of course, China has also donated vaccines, but we have seen that technology transfer and partnerships have become a vital part of Chinese vaccine diplomacy. And that's not only in the short term, but it's more in the long term as well, with plans to build a vaccine production facility in different countries, such as Chile. So even though these two different strategies, vaccine donations and technology transfer, they both positively impact developing economies, we see that donation of vaccines alone has not achieved the desired goals, and is therefore one of the main reasons for the gap that we see in the access to the vaccine. That happens, of course, because the number of doses, first of all, that has been distributed globally has been below the expected, and that has been happening for different reasons, including high-income countries ordering vaccines and using all the capacity that facilities can have right now. But also because donations do not create long-lasting sustainable vaccine production capacity to guarantee enough supply for the entire global population. On the contrary, donations only reinforce the structural dependency on vaccines produced elsewhere. So the current expansion that we see from the Chinese biopharmaceutical sector suggests that China might be trying to fill this technological gap left by Western countries and increase its political ties with middle and low-income countries through direct investment and technology transfer. And this has been something seen by scholars for a long time now, and they have been calling attention to this expansion, calling it the health Silk Road. So I'm going to keep my presentation very brief so we can debate more about it, but I want to conclude my presentation by proposing that we debate the implication of this global competition for public goods, but also debate the role of the state and markets for life-saving technologies. Because markets like the one for vaccines present failures that state has been addressing in different forms as grants, human resources, or infrastructure. But most countries still seem to maintain the idea that the state should not address vaccine allocation, relying mostly on donations and philanthropy. So I'll end my presentation here, and I'm looking forward for the discussion. I'll hand it over now to Anthea.
So thanks very much, and thanks for organising this today. I think it's a very timely topic. I was doing a bit of research on it this morning and seeing multiple new developments happening, and this is one of the difficulties, but also one of the challenges that's positive in this area, which is trying to keep on top of how quickly this is moving. So Peter started off with an analytical frame about connection and disconnection. So I want to start off with an analytical frame that some of you have maybe heard me talk about before, which is the idea of dragonfly thinking and dragonfly eyes. And I draw this idea from Philip Tetlock, who is a psychologist and also a political scientist in America, who works on futures work and also forecasting. And what he's done in many of the different competitions that they've run about forecasting is he's identified a group of people that he says are the best of super forecasters. They're the best ones at predicting what's likely to happen in the future. And one of their, and they're actually significantly better than the CIA, I should say, even without access to classified information. But what's really interesting about the group of super forecasters is he says that they have dragonfly vision. And so the dragonfly vision actually comes from the idea that dragonflies have two different eyes, but each eye is made up of thousands of different lenses. And by looking through all those thousands of different lenses and seeking to integrate them to give a more holistic picture, dragonflies are one of the few animals that can see almost 360 degrees. And he says it's actually the types of thinkers that are able to put together multiple diverse perspectives and stitch them together to create a more holistic account that tend to have much better understandings of complex situations and much better predictive power going forward. So key to this idea is this ability to look at complex issues through multiple lenses. And I want to say that one of the things that we're starting to see in US policy vis-a-vis China is an attempt to move towards dragonfly vision, but one that has not fully been realized yet. So let me talk that through. So what we see in Biden's US-China strategy is a 3 C's approach. They say we want to simultaneously with China compete, cooperate, and confront in different areas. So they want to compete in areas of economics and technology, where they want to be sort of dual competitors and seek advantage in various markets and various developments. They also want to cooperate with China on global challenges, and chief among the global challenges are climate change, but also what Alex just mentioned, which is things like pandemics. And finally, they want to confront China in certain areas. And we see this very much happening in the South China Sea, where they're concerned about militarization and access to sea lines. We see it happening with cyber. We also see it happening on Xinjiang and some of the human rights concerns. And so one way to actually understand what is happening here is that in the last generation, in the sort of era of Trump, we saw a lot of debates about should we have an economic lens on China of opportunity and cooperation? Should we have a security lens on China, great power threat, shut it down, decouple? And what you actually see Biden attempting to do here in his policy is to create a more dragonfly approach of saying compete, cooperate, and confront simultaneously, but in different areas. But this is a problematic approach that he's doing too. It's a partial dragonfly, but not a full dragonfly. So a full approach to dragonfly is really an idea of integrative complexity, and integrative complexity has two different stages to it. So the first stage is that you need to differentiate multiple lenses. So you need to be understanding multiple ways of looking at this complex reality. And I would say that there are 4 lenses that are particularly important in starting to understand this US-China relationship that we are seeing permeating in these global challenges that are being discussed today. The first is what I would have said in my recent book is as kind of an establishment, a pro-establishment approach to economic globalization, which is that it's win-win, that we need to cooperate, that this is how we get economic efficiency, that we need open markets and we need a lot of exchange between us. And that's really the point that Jensen was identifying about the period of high globalization. The second lens that's really important is sort of a global threats lens, which says that there are major global challenges out there and climate change is the most obvious, and that we actually need to reorient our economies domestically and internationally so that we try to survive and thrive within the limits of our planet. And that means that we need to shift from a focus on economic efficiency to a focus on sustainability. And what this one has in contrast to the establishment narrative is it shifts the frame from an efficiency economic frame to a sufficiency and sustainability frame. But what it has in common with the establishment approach is it says one of the ways that we will want to get to greater sustainability is very much through having technological cooperation between China and the United States and in markets. And we see that coming through very strongly in Peter's comments and also in Christian's comments. The two other things that we see, the two other frames I think are very important for understanding these dynamics are then your geopolitical, geoeconomic security frame. And that's something we see very much coming through in Jensen and Dirk's comments, which is that there is this roaring back of geopolitical rivalry and that there are deep security concerns between these two nations on both sides. Neither side trusts each other. But these are also increasingly playing out in more and more areas. So this is no longer just about the South China Sea. This is going into many other areas. And Jensen is right to say that states have always designated some areas to be security areas. But what we're seeing in the digital economy is that that's now moving not just to digital infrastructure like telecommunications, but it's moving into electricity. So like the definition of what counts as critical infrastructure is growing and growing and growing. And as everything becomes more data-based, more and more and more things are going to be falling into this category. And that then takes us to the fourth frame that I think is relevant, which is a sort of a protectionist frame, which is that when you look at the big competition that's happening between not just China and the US, but also Europe, they're partly battling it out in these technology grounds, not just for geopolitical advantage, but because getting a head start in some of these areas like AI and semiconductors and those sorts of things are going to be the lifeblood of the digital economy. They're going to be the lifeblood of a clean energy transition. They're going to be a lifeblood in terms of industrial policy and strategic advantage. And so actually, if we want to take a dragonfly approach, we need to be taking into consideration all of these different aspects. But it's not enough to just differentiate, because I said to you there were two aspects of Dragonfly Vision, and the second aspect is integration. And I would say that integration means we don't just prioritize one of these views, but nor can we easily separate them in the way that the US has sought to do. And we see this most clearly recently when Kerry goes to China ahead of COP and says, we want to have a deal. And he says, climate change is not ideological, it's not partisan, it's not a geostrategic weapon. This is something we should cooperate on. And China's foreign ministry comes back and says, you want to treat climate change as an oasis within the broader desert that is the US-China relationship. And the thing about an oasis in the desert is sooner or later, the oasis becomes the desert. We won't play with you. And so what we see here is that the US attempt to differentiate its different frames and keep them separate is falling foul of China's reaction, which is these are inherently connected and they're inherently ones we need to integrate. So where is the rubber going to hit the road for third countries? And this goes to Dirk's point. And where is it going to hit the road for countries like Australia? So I'm just going to say that one of the areas where this is going to hit the road is going to be in investment decisions and in investment screening decisions. So what we are facing at the moment, and here Peter is absolutely right, we need an absolutely massive transition in our economies towards a clean energy base. But the thing about that clean energy base is it's going to be very digitally heavy. And so it's going to be very strongly subject to these concerns raised by Christian and Jensen about geopolitics. And so that's why we're now seeing it really play out in things like investment screening decisions. Now, when we understand investment screening decisions, and we see this at the moment with the electricity board in Australia, you could understand that a lot of it is playing at the moment between like an economic lens of we need foreign investment and we need investment into our critical infrastructure versus a security lens of I'm a bit concerned that this infrastructure has Chinese companies in it or might report back data to the Chinese government or might put in things for spying or might put in chokehold risk. So you've got like an economic and security framing there. But I think we also need to be adding at least a third part of this, which is also an environmental framing of like what we need to do to go towards a climate, to deal with the climate crisis. And so here we're starting to try to work out in an integrative policy way, how do we deal with different types of risk? So at the moment, the geopolitical risk and the security risk is particularly salient to governments and it's particularly proximate to their experiences. And there's a decent chance that they're underplaying the slightly longer term but more serious and more exponential climate change risk. And so how do we integrate into our national interest frameworks the different types of risks that we're playing in this risk framework? Because a lot of the national interest stuff that we have at the moment is about economic security and values, and environment is there loosely. And so how do we kind of much more consciously infuse it into our security and economic decisions? But the second is it's not just going to be risk trade-offs, it's going to be risk and uncertainty playoffs, because a lot of what a country like Australia is doing at the moment is it's making decisions about technology and about data in a world where it's deeply uncertain what level of decoupling we're going to have. And I think it's clear that we're going to have some level of decoupling. What's uncertain, as Jensen would say, is where we're going to fall on that spectrum. So how do you make decisions about which companies to allow to do foreign investment into something as crucial as your energy sector for an energy transition, when you don't know in the next 5 to 10 years how bifurcated the technology systems will be, how much data you'll be able to share across borders? And that's why I think in the next era going forward, you're going to hear me at least talking a lot, not just about integrative decision-making and integrative policy-making, but much stronger ideas about how do you govern in complexity and uncertainty, and also how do you deal with different systems that are somewhat separated but somewhat together through notions like interoperability, permeability, membranes, because these are not going to be totally together systems, they're not going to be totally separate systems. And so instead of debating whether it should be decoupling or not, security or economics or environment or not, I think it's going to be all of those things. And a lot of what we're going to be doing is working out these mechanisms of exchange, of data, of interoperability, of technology to work out how we navigate forward given this dragonfly situation of competing and conflicting frames that we need to understand this complex relationship through.
Thanks, Anthea, and thank you, everyone. That's fascinating to hear everybody's reflections on those kind of vastly different but seemingly connected domains and how changing relationships between states might affect them all. We're at 1:30. We've got about half an hour to go. So what I thought we might do is, well, let's just open it up for Q&A with everybody. So do put your question in the chat box, raise your hand. I might kick us off with a question that I know we've all discussed at varying lengths over the recent weeks as we were preparing for this. But that is, and Anthea touched on this at the very end, is further strategic competition, the types of disconnections that Peter alluded to at the beginning, are they inevitable? Are they going to get worse? And is there areas for cooperation, and is that even possible? I'll open that up to everybody. If anyone wants to jump in. Peter, I can start with you if you like. You were the first cab off the rank.
Well, I'd like to think they weren't inevitable, but if you have a look at history, it would suggest that certainly the tensions between China and the United States will continue. So I mean, I think clearly that strategic struggle is not going to go away anytime soon. I mean, I think that's very clear.
So I can jump in here to say, I really think that this is going to be an ongoing issue. And I think it raises really interesting issues for us as academics about how we deal with that, because I think the first generation response is often, is this good or is this bad? And a huge amount of lamenting from people saying this is bad. But I also think this is, and this will happen. And a lot of the work we need to do is work out how do we navigate in light of this. And I think it could be the case that many governments have too strong a focus on security issues and not enough on some of the environmental. It could also be sometimes in the academy that we don't have enough of a focus on the security stuff and more of a focus on the environment, partly because of access to information. We don't have the access to confidential stuff, but also partly ideologically, the academy tends to be more left, and the left tends to be much more sort of recognizing of things like climate change threats than things like national security threats in that more traditional way. But I actually think our biggest challenge as academics navigating this field is actually working out how do we navigate through this, because I think it is going to be happening, and the question is how and when, not if and should.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues is we've been talking a little bit about can you cooperate in some domains and while competing in others. But in fact, what will happen is you might try and cooperate, but it's going to be under what constraints? Typically, international cooperation is under various parameters. And I think those parameters or the constraints under which any cooperation, or perhaps something more like collaboration, what constraints do they take place in different domains to the extent that domains intersect as well? Jensen, Dirk, or Alex, did you have any thoughts?
I'll just jump in very quickly. I mean, I sort of agree with the answer, and I guess Peter as well, that, you know, this is going to happen. So now we just have to deal with it as it is. If we're thinking, you know, as a third country or as companies or in the academy as well. What sort of strikes me is that for the climate component, if I'm thinking a lot of the emerging economies around there, and yes, I take your point at the start, Christian, that, you know, there's been a lot of publicly financed coal power plants in Bangladesh, Vietnam, and other countries around the world, and escaping coal is extremely difficult. But I see a lot of interest now from, you know, countries in our region and just Asia more generally, they're pretty open to financing for battery technology, for solar and wind and hydro and other technologies there. I think we can see a lot of countries finding their own way to navigate this, even if that cooperation isn't always there at the top level between those two countries. You'll find other countries will sort of, you know, drive it because it's for some countries it's just so vital that we find solutions both in mitigation and adaptation to climate change, which is all the challenges that we face globally, is obviously the most front and center. And so we will see, I think, a lot of other countries will find solutions to this, even when, you know, the US and China are at complete loggerheads.
Yeah, thanks, Dirk. I agree, I guess to an extent, but I think that the wrinkle is that is the climate science. So that that we can't necessarily afford to allow states to incrementally go down the path that they will, I think, because of the markets and so forth. There's a greater interest in batteries for various reasons, but we really need to cut off supply to these fossil fuels, or at least financial supply, as quickly as possible if we're going to have any chance of holding global temperatures to well below 2 degrees. So this is where climate change makes some of these policy problems a little bit more tricky because the typical levers we might rely on, like market-based incentives, will arguably be too slow in a world where we've kind of run out of time. But it's interesting to think about in which areas that applies and which it doesn't. I might just go to Emma Ays, but a colleague from RegNet who's got her hand up. Emma, over to you for your question.
Yeah, thanks, Christian, and thanks, everyone, for a fascinating discussion so far. I find myself in the unusual position of wanting to be a bit more optimistic than my peers, and that is to point out that sometimes countries and people do the right things for the wrong reasons, and I think there might be quite substantial elements of that on the climate front here. So arguably a large part of the European enthusiasm for renewable energy, and indeed perhaps Chinese efforts, is about getting less dependent on your fossil fuel source, Russia in the case of the Europeans and Australia in the case of the Chinese. So that's one angle where I think actually these geopolitical tensions might actually be helping us on the climate front. The other one, which I've talked extensively with Anthea and others about, is in fact that the technology competition aspect and this sort of geoeconomics is arguably one of the big drivers of the massive investments in what I call green industrial policy that we see all the major players engaging in. And, you know, we, as was just pointed out, we are not going to get there with a carbon price alone these days. We need massive green industrial policy. So insofar as this competition is a driver of that, it's really beneficial. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Emma. Anthea, did you want to respond to that?
I was just going to say on Emma's last point, part of this is also going to be a question of sequencing. So some of the work we did early on in our geoeconomic work was thinking that if you were going to have sort of China rising and the US and some of the Western states being defensive, what were the different things that the West was going to do that were going to be defensive policies? And we divided it into three main types of policies. So the first one was shielding, which is trying to protect your technological advantage at home through things like investment screening and not letting your technology companies be bought. And so that's the rise of foreign investment review boards, etc. The second was stifling, which is it wasn't just enough to kind of protect your assets at home. They were likely to go out into third markets and try to sort of kneecap and disable and disadvantage their competitors abroad. And that's clearly what we're seeing with Huawei, et cetera, in third markets, where the US is really trying to sort of hobble that company. And they're often ones that are considered as sort of aggressive and negative. But the third one we identified was spurring, which is it's not enough if you're the technological leader to just think, I want to protect the technological advantage I have. You also need to be making sure that you continue to run faster. And that, we said, was going to likely lead to much more in industrial policy, much more sort of into research and development. And that's, I think, what Emma's pointing to here. And that's been a little bit slower on the uptake in the US. They were much faster to shield and stifle than they were to spur, but we're starting to see that action towards spurring. And that we're starting to see it in multiple different centers. So it's a complex game of not just cooperation versus competition, but both at the same time with pros and cons across sectors.
Thanks, Anthea. Alex, I might bring you in here because you mentioned we've spoken about technology sharing, cooperation, competition, and so forth, and a lot of it has been focused around the energy climate side. But drawing on your initial comments on vaccines in the health sector, how do you see this playing out?
Well, I see that there are a lot of developing countries interested in receiving that kind of assistance and technology, but it is what is going to be shared and what we're going to see in the future really depends on what kind of technology is involved and the interest of the major players in that. So of course we see that, for example, China has been very strong in going to middle-income countries and saying we can build facilities here to produce vaccines, but their technology is also not the most innovative and new technology that we have in terms of vaccines, for example. So it would be interesting to reflect on what would be the scenario if China was the one developing mRNA vaccines, for example. Would we be also seeing China being cooperative with those countries or not? Or what kind of arrangements we would see in this sense? And but I think there's still, even though that's something that we have to reflect on, there's still a strong contrast with the approach by the US, in the sense that US has not been putting the state as an important player in this allocation of vaccines. We've seen that the US have been going to companies like Moderna saying, could you please, build a facility somewhere else or cooperate with the World Health Organization, and Moderna decides to do it by itself without cooperating internationally, which is not very positive for the US as a geopolitical strategy in this context. So it's still a very different approach, and I think what will be important in the future is to see who owns the most innovative technology and what they are willing to share.
Thank you, Alex. And Miranda, did you have your hand up there?
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for a really stimulating panel. I wanted to connect what you guys had been saying with to our first conversations panel on relationality, because I was really thinking about what role does trust and the building up and then the losing of trust play in these patterns that you've been observing. And I'm wondering, well, what you could think of as being ways to rejuvenate the trust that we can see driving these disconnections. I know, Peter, you pointed to the sort of the importance of local government, and I think that that sort of scaling down must have to do with the development of that interpersonal trust. Anthea, you referred to, that meeting of leaders face to face to discuss, well, this is what we think is going to happen ahead of the COP meeting. And so what do you all see as being those major ways, I suppose, of ramping up trust, given that that's what we're going to need to ensure that there isn't too much of the Galapagos world and we've got a little bit more Californication happening. Dirk, I've fallen into the same trap as you. Thank you.
Thanks, Miranda. Peter, did you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think so my first point is that unfortunately at the moment, the United States, particularly say with these initiatives at home with the Department of Justice, is really creating distrust and fear at very micro levels within university environments. So its leadership really could not be worse at this particular moment. What we have to hope for, in a way, is that non-state-based forums begin to find ways of cooperating over the sharing of knowledge, and that social movements become even more active. So, if we have a look at the whole history of technology transfer, state-based or treaty-based pathways have simply not been successful. And, we've got 50, 60 years of treaty negotiations to prove that. So in the end, I think a lot now will depend on the way in which scientific communities perceive their role and how active scientific communities will become. We've got examples like the free software movement, for example, which has done an awful lot to keep mathematics in the public domain. And what we really can't afford is for much science now to become privatized. That's the worst possible turn that we could have. And so trust building is going to have to take place at these institutional levels where it's possible to talk frankly and freely without some ideologically driven agenda. And that's hard and that's slow. But I see that as being the only way, because I think, unfortunately, the United States is really forcing countries to choose. That essentially means it's going to be very hard to build trust in state-based fora. So we're going to have to look to fora